I cannot put on my camera.
Sure, not a problem. We're just getting the live stream
You could
started.
just be the spooky disembodied voice.
I cannot put on my camera.
Sure, not a problem. We're just getting the live stream
You could
started.
just be the spooky disembodied voice.
Mute that before that becomes a problem. All right, so we are basically at the top of the hour, so we might as well get going. Thank you all for coming to today's popular culture dialogue on the current state of horror across popular culture. And I do think it's an interesting time. There's a lot of interesting things coming out for horror. So we kind of wanted to talk about that during spooky season, at least in the Western Hemisphere, and increasingly Hollywood being one of those things Halloween being one of those things exported around the world. That itself is kind of spooky. So I'm doing my best. This is the scariest thing I own is a Dalek t-shirt. So I figure that's scary enough. But my partner Chris has his Reanimator shirt on. So he's representing the household more that way. And with us, we have 3 returning guests. So wonderful to have you all here today. We have Christine Tomlinson, Colette Balmain, and Princess O'Nika. I always get this one.
O'Nika
Auguste, yeah. O'Nika. So yeah, we're here to talk about horror today on October 29th. And I kind of just want to let everyone maybe say a little bit about what brings them here to talk about horror. And because he's sitting next to me, I'm going to go to Chris first.
All right, well, I'm Christopher J. Olson. I'm a ABD PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and along with Carrie Lynn, I co-wrote a book on exorcism cinema and the cultural tensions that we find within. But beyond that, I've just been a horror fan my whole life. I mean, you can see I'm wearing my Reanimator shirt, my nerdy fancy with Reanimator. I grew up on the horror films of the 80s and have never stopped loving them. So that's kind of why I'm here to talk about them, because I still like horror. I still watch a lot of it.
Great, thank you. And then we'll go over to Christine.
Hello, I'm Christine Tomlinson. I am a lecturer at the University of California, Irvine. I mostly study video games, but I also study other forms of pop culture. Right now I have a background of Night in the Woods, which is a semi-spooky game set in fall and around Halloween. I have also been raised on horror. My mom got me into it when I was a little kid with also movies from the 80s. So I've been watching them forever. Admittedly, I tend towards some of the gorier movies. They're my favorite. But yeah, excited to be talking about where horror is now, because I think there are a lot of interesting things, and hopefully I can slide some things in about video games that are doing some neat stuff too.
I think we kind of have to, because there's some really fascinating stuff happening in video games, especially when you add the virtual reality component to it. All right, down to Colette.
Yes, I'm a lecturer at Kingston University. I don't know, I can't really recollect why I like horror, because nobody in my family does, so I wasn't brought up with it. I was brought up with being told not to watch it, so perhaps that was it. So I don't know where it comes from. But yeah, I grew up like 80s horror. It is kind of a period that was really influential for me. But I watch a lot of global horror cinema, and so I'm kind of interested in how horror functions outside of kind of the US or the West, the ways in which it's taken up. So yeah, so it's really nice to be part of this discussion about, because I think there's too many times horror is dismissed that it's going nowhere, nothing's happening, but then you're just looking at a very small portion of what's out there.
Yeah, and I know that we've been in contact with the Laotian, yeah. And Maddie Doe, and she's done some really fascinating stuff in Laos when it comes to horror. So yeah, there's some really great stuff going on out there. So I'm glad to have the outside of the US perspective when it comes to horror too. And down to Princess then.
Hi, I'm Princess O'Nika Auguste, and I'm a PhD student at Dublin City University. And I've always liked horror. I mean, um, I was born in the 80s and grew up in the 90s, so I grew up watching Freddy Krueger and Friday the 13th and Jason and Chucky and all these kind of the Exorcist. So I always loved it. My brothers, I used to watch it with my brothers, um, but I never grew out of it. My mother doesn't like horror. I mean, none of the older generation like horror, but my brothers used to watch it. I used to watch it with them, but I never grew out of it. And I believe that horror has a lot of social commentary on it. I mean, even when you look at who dies 1st.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's when you get to like
Yeah.
Jordan Peele's most recent works too, kind of commenting on all of that.
Mm.
So just to say, I guess in terms of myself, I didn't really grow up a horror fan. I didn't watch any of those 80s things. The first time I saw Halloween was in a horror film class at UW-Madison. But I do remember my father, I'm not going to say my parents, even though my parents claimed that they sat me down in front of the Poltergeist when I was very young because they wanted me to stop watching television and they hoped I'd be scared away from it. And my father had a unique sense of humor growing up. He was always trying to scare the dickens out of us. So I was never a really huge horror fan until I think Blair Witch Project, and I really clicked with found footage style. So that's my favorite.
That I was.
Oh no, freeze. And I'll say Blair Witch also scared me because I grew up
in high school. Well, so I grew up watching that.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw it at the Angelica when I was in New York City for a summer internship. And I remember the next time I tried to watch it by myself, I had to pause it several times because I could not handle it. I was getting so worked up. So that's kind of where I come in for horror. But looking around now, I mean, Blair Witch was 1999, so that's 24 years ago. What is the current state of horror when it comes to films and TV and books and everything? I don't know if it's just me being looking for it more, but there seems to be a lot of it out there these days in all these different media. And are we seeing any common themes? Are there any common tropes, or do you see things happening in horror these days that maybe is different from the horror of the past, like the 90s and the 80s? I don't know who'd like to start that.
Well, I see more like horror now. We're talking about Get Out. We were just talking about Get Out. Is more like more. It's always been social commentary on it, but now you can actually, you don't have to interpret or dig for it. You can actually see the social commentary.
This is true. It's that one in particular. It's very much surface level, overt. Hey, we're talking about racism here. Yeah.
Mhm.
I think, and I don't know that I like these words, but I think the kind of watchwords for horror these days are trauma and elevated. Because there are a lot of people who talk about, you know, this new movement of like elevated horror, meaning like the A24, Hereditary, Midsummer, Men, that sort of thing. And a lot of, I think, horror films these days are kind of seen as metaphors for various types of trauma. But I think, you know, like I said, I don't really like those watchwords because, like Princess was saying, horror has always been a commentary. It's always been elevated in some form. You know, I mean, even you can look back at the gore fests of the 80s and still find commentary, you know, somewhere in there. So I think, you know, we're seeing people who are trying to put horror up on this sort of pedestal these days as a way to make it more respectable or whatever. But I think it's, you know, it's still out there and we're still seeing a proliferation of it these days, and there's a lot of really good stuff out there, I think, and a lot of really interesting stuff that is taking some of those subtext and putting them at the, making it text, basically.
I agree with those takes. I also think that it's sort of interesting that we're seeing a lot more kind of genre mashing going on, like especially with comedy. It's always kind of been there, like you see it with Evil Dead, you see it with Army of Darkness, but like I think that a turning point was maybe 2006 with Shaun of the Dead, where now you see kind of less fear of mashing these things together. Renfield is a good example that just came out. So yeah, I think that's also sort of interesting. A lot more text, a lot less subtext, and a lot more playing around with the genre.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think it's interesting that we have this concept of elevated horror. And when you think about Silence of the Lambs, that was held up when it won the awards as kind of an example of something that's more than horror. So there's this idea that horror is of low value unless it can be seen in an intellectual light. So kind of like body horror is still seen as quite lowbrow in relationship to the other kind of horror films. So I think it's difficult. I think, of course, horror pulls on what's happening at the moment, because if you're going to scare, or if you're going to talk to your audience, you have to be talking to them in their language. You can't be talking to them in the language of 20 years ago. And so I think it's always quite current, because although there are things that we're frightened of, I think there's always things that happen in society that we're particularly frightened of. And perhaps the reason why we have such a kind of so much horror at the moment might have something to do with the state of the world. What's the relationship to what's actually happening at the moment? I think it's interesting.
I like that idea of you have to speak to them in a common language, because I think it also applies not just, temporarily, but spatially. And I say that because I mentioned that like found footage movies scare me, but also zombie movies have always been the most scary for me, especially rage zombies where they're running. Those I have a hard time with. And I think back to like Train to Busan from South Korea. And there's so many horror movies coming out of South Korea now where, in the past we've had like Japanese horror. So that I think had an impact, at least in the United States, more through the adaptations than the actual Japanese horror. But what's interesting with like the South Korean horror, whether it's Train to Busan or The Kingdom or All of Us Are Dead, is that they're put up through these streaming platforms relatively pure. I mean, they're not even dubbed, they're subtitled, and yet they're still, I think, touching upon a common language about the human experience, that they're still effective even if you have to read subtitles while you're watching the horror.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, I think, you mentioned before, I think before you started the stream, you mentioned Matty Doe from Laos, who directed the films Chantilly, Dear Sister, and The Long Walk. And in Matty Doe's interviews, she discusses why she decided to make horror movies, and it's because there are these sort of cultural specificities to different horror films, but there's also sort of a universal idea of scary stuff, things like ghosts and monsters and all that sort of stuff. And it's easy, I think, for a lot of people to sort of take a basic idea like, the dead come back to life and make it scary, but also make it, scary in a way that's going to resonate both with people at home and abroad. And I think, the interesting thing, you bring up the South Korean horror, so much of South Korean media is like focus tested to very specific things and designed to sort of resonate on a big stage. You know, you think of things like K-pop or K-dramas and all that. It's designed to really resonate with audiences in South Korea, but also around the world. And so there's like an interesting sort of political economic thing going on there in terms of like how you make horror universal, but also very specific. And I think the other thing going in with what Colette was saying, you know, when we think about what's going on in the world, there's a lot of things that are impacting the world, you know, in different areas that are very similar. You know, there's a rise of fascism in the United States, but there's a rise of fascism kind of all around the world. And there's, you know, poverty all around the world. And there's all these things that are going on that are very specific to an area, but also very relatable to people outside of that area. So I think we're seeing a lot of that coming into play, especially with how mediated everything is. People, you know, can know what's going on in other countries a lot easier than they could have, you know, in the past. And suddenly it opens up all these avenues that people can use to scare the others.
Yeah, I mean, you can't get really further away from a global impact than climate change, and the pandemic, I suppose, both of those. And I don't know, movies might be taking a little bit longer, especially in the United States with the strikes that we've had recently. But do you see in horror and popular culture, are we seeing the reflections on climate change and the pandemic and these types of high concern global issues these days?
I mean, I kind of think with I can remember seeing ecological horror in the 80s. So I think horror has always perhaps been ahead of the discourse on these things in looking for kind of, I think, the next area that will be concerned. So so I think that's kind of always kind of been there. Whether we're seeing more films at the moment, I think that's kind of interesting. I don't know if I've seen anything recently. I've seen things in the past, but there have been things that have been kind of influenced by the pandemic, but I still think they're taking time to filter through.
I mean, I think we are seeing a lot of those things, but I think a lot of them, you know, we have stuff like Knock at the Cabin, which is very much sort of tapping into these big global type of horrors. We have, what was that? There was a movie, it was like a post-apocalyptic thing about a disease that wiped a bunch of people out, and there were just a bunch of people living out in a cabin. I can't remember what it was called now, but
the one with Joel Edgerton.
Yeah, Joel Edgerton and those cats. I don't remember what it's called, but there's that. But then, you know, you have like exploitation filmmakers are doing a lot of this stuff. Like I think of, like, I'm a big fan of Charles Band. Like I said, I'm wearing my Reanimator shirt, you know, Empire Pictures Forever and all that sort of stuff. But in 2020, Charles Band released a film called Corona Zombies because he had, you know, somebody had told him, yeah, there's this coronavirus thing going around. I hear rumors that, you know, things are going to start to shut down. And like in a weekend, they shot this stupid zombie movie that used like footage from other zombie movies, but they shot, you know, they just went out to somebody's house and shot some stuff. So I think you're seeing a lot of, you know, sort of down and dirty productions that are able to kind of capitalize on these things in ways that maybe big studios are still sort of getting to. But we did also see a lot of, you know, pandemic productions that were made. Like I think of the one we just watched, like we all went to we're all going to the World's Fair, which, you know, isn't necessarily a horror movie, but it's got horror overtones. And that was kind of like a pandemic era film. You have Benson and Moorhead making like There's Something in the Dirt. You know, these producers who are able to just kind of go out and do things on the fly are really kind of tapping into a lot of these things.
Christine?
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting, and this is a half-formed thought, so I apologize. But I think that there are some things that gain a lot of popularity that are speaking to those issues, like the pandemic, like ecological disaster, in a sort of roundabout way, so that we're getting kind of back to that subtext thing where it's metaphorical and people are maybe a little bit more comfortable with those kinds of messages. But if you think of like the success of the Last of Us series, which kind of gets at both of those experiences in a way that is maybe a little bit safer for people to experience. And I think that that's really interesting too.
Yeah. And I think there is something to say about the political economic aspect too. And it kind of goes back to the whole elevated horror thing too, is that a lot of horror is done low budget. It's done shoestring, it's done indie and things like this. And I could see then why people who are horror fans who are making horror now are trying to legitimize it to some extent and are happy to have these big budgets, even though sometimes I think they work. I don't think Malignant worked as well as people think it did, or Smile worked as much as people think it did. But it is that attempt to say, hey, look, horror is a legitimate product, and it's not just low budget anymore. It can be these bigger budget things that still have that social commentary, although I'm not really sure what Malignant's social commentary was, other than mental illness is still very, very scary, and you should shun anyone with mental illness. And that's my problem with that movie. One of my problems, but but I also think we see it in terms of this idea of the low budget. Christine, to speak to your area, there's a lot of low budget horror games out there now too. And it seems like it is like with film, it's a quick way to make money, it seems.
Yeah, there's a lot of low budget many video games. But it is like sometimes there's like an indie game that really taps into something, even though it's kind of quickly made or not large scale, that people seem to enjoy. I think that it's a similar kind of issue across different types of media, though. Something is so low budget and still trying to send some kind of emotional experience, perhaps without the social messaging. I think that it falls a little bit more flat because people pick up on that. So I think it's a sort of delicate balance. You can pump something out just to try to make money, but I think that people notice when there isn't heart to it, which is a sort of interesting thing to think about in the context of horror.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting just how many of these low budget games are, very simple. Like I think of things like Inside, or I forget what the other game that the people who made Inside, they made another one with the spider chasing after the kid in the woods and all that sort of stuff. But despite the simplicity, there's a lot of these games that are really trying to explore a lot of really deep issues. Like there's so many games out there trying to explore mental illness in different ways. And I don't remember if it was Inside or if it was some other game, but like you're being pursued by this large, like maybe it was Gris, that might have been it. The French game, like you're being pursued by this like dark spirit or something, and it's supposed to be depression and all that sort of stuff. So we're getting these really sort of down and dirty things that are made really cheaply and really on the fly, but they're trying to do that elevated horror kind of thing. And I keep seeing like somebody moving in the door behind Precious there, and I keep thinking, oh gosh, there's a murderer trying to get a princess over there. It's very much of a horror thing.
Sorry, it was my
No.
housekeeper.
I was worried for you.
See, we're talking about horror and we're done getting ourselves worked up.
There's going to be an unfriended situation where everybody's on the computer and the spirit shows up.
Go ahead, Princess.
Oh, I was saying that I know like some of us here feel like that some of the horror movies that are lacking. I like oh god, I can't pronounce the movie.
Malignant.
Malignant. And because I didn't think that they were trying to have a social message. I think it was one of those movies. It was just it was supposed to be just a great scare. Um, I I kind of like when the horror movies don't have a social commentary because sometimes you need a break. I'm a break. You just need to. Sometimes you just need a good scare. That's all you need.
As the door
And
opens.
so it's the little puppy, Foxy.
Oh,
The dog opened the door.
Okay. Oh,
So maybe we'll have a little evil dog coming up. Anyway, yes, and I don't play much video games that deal with horror, but when they spit out video games and movies that don't have a, s- a social commentary, I think it's great because now Shakado was not a horror movie, but it was great fun. Low budget, great fun. So you can have you sometimes you don't need all that social commentary. Sometimes we need a break from that. Sometimes we just need a good scare.
yeah. And
And I think a lot of people, while some people notice that it doesn't some horror movies don't have a social message, other people like the fact that it doesn't because they don't. Not everybody wants to be preached at all the time.
well, and I think we just watched Terrifier, and we have to watch Terrifier 2. And I don't know if there's a social message in that one. It was just a lot of innovative kills, really.
there's an
I
interesting.
mean, I think, yeah.
Go ahead.
So, no, sorry. I was just going to say to kind of on that, I think I have a PhD student who's just about to finish her PhD, and she's doing it on women in horror. And so when she started her PhD, and she did her MA on it. When she did her MA, there was very few films directed by women. What we have seen lately is we've seen a lot more female directors of horror, and they're reworking like the tropes. So, like the revenge film, they don't do that. Oh, we're going to show you 15 minutes of rape. They don't do that. They kind of subvert the genre, and so they talk about it, but they talk about it from a different perspective. And I think that, and along with kind of Black directors as well, that's what I think we've seen the innovation is by having more people who traditionally were very marginalized in cinema to be kind of behind the camera. And I think for me, I mean, one of my favorite films a few years ago is a film called Starless, which is by a female director. And yeah, I mean, it kind of does that about isolation in, how you can be isolated in groups of people. But there's a whole body of films by women that I think are really pushing the genre, and having something to say. And I kind of think that, I don't know, perhaps they're the films that I feel more affinity to, like The Terrifier. Really not for me. I mean, I've seen both of them, but you see, I like a story. I need a story. I'm very story orientated. So I think for me, films that don't do that, don't engage me. I like it to do something. I like there to be characters. And I think that's why, because the other thing that's happened is bringing back all those kind of franchises like Halloween, like Scream, and, Scream being incredibly successful in ways that Halloween hasn't been.
Yeah, I mean, it brought back, it's the nostalgia aspect that I think comes to it. And even if it's not bringing back the franchise, when we were watching Terrifier, we noted, they're using John Carpenter font. You can see those influences of Carpenter in particular on a lot of more recent horror films, which is really fascinating too. Chris?
Well, I was just going to say, it's interesting that while we have this sort of big resurgence of horror, and horror is kind of, I don't know if I want to say it's more respected, but horror is at least more visible, and I think people are praising it more. We also have this movement of like throwback stuff, like Fire, and there was I forget where it was made, but there was a movie called The Last Matinee, which was like a throwback to the Italian giallo films and things like that. And then you also have the sort of proliferation of these boutique home video and restoration labels like Vinegar Syndrome and Severin and Arrow and all that, which are mining, the sort of horror of the past. I think there's a movement in horror of people who are sort of, like you said, they're nostalgic or sort of looking back to the horror of the 80s as, and sort of holding it up as this this very formative decade for horror, and I think it's showing up in a lot of films. I mean, Malignant and Terrifier both are sort of films that we're trying to address the idea that we don't have, very recognizable characters like Freddy or Jason or Michael Myers or Chucky or any of that. And suddenly now we have Art the Clown, who is, very popular, or we have whatever, I can't remember what Malignant's name was, what the demon, I just call it Malignant because I'm like, that's the title. But those were sort of attempts to create these new horror icons that could spawn big franchises and whatnot. And so I think we're seeing, in addition to this movement for like elevated horror and metaphorical horror and stuff, we're also just seeing a throwback, like this throwback movement where people are trying to recapture the gore fests of old and all that sort of stuff.
Or you're seeing like it moving from video games to movies then too, because is Five Nights at Freddy's launching now too?
Yeah.
And again, you're talking small indie game becoming this huge cultural phenomenon, and the amount of horror games that were influenced by it too are fascinating as well. And that's all I got really to say on that one right now.
I think it's interesting. When I did some work on a film called Detention, which is a Taiwanese film, and it's a Taiwanese horror film that deals with the White Terror. So it's dealing with like historical trauma. But what's really interesting about it is that in kind of like, I think it was another example of a Chinese film, is that sequels, so Detention's based on a video game. And then I think there's one about Bridge Curse, and the sequel to that is a video game. So I think the kind of boundaries between video games and films is very fluid these days. There's a lot of like transmedia. So, and I think video games is a place to mine for horror, because it's always been a really rich place where, I mean, I think about like Resident Evil and Silent Hill were the games that I played, the horror games that I played first. And I think they were doing something perhaps that wasn't happening in cinema. They were scary. So I think it's really interesting of the interplay. So it's kind of like, in order to know some of the story, I then have to go and find the game.
Christine?
Yeah, I have multiple thoughts, but sort of just building off of this one. I think it's interesting to think about it from an experiential standpoint for players or audiences, because the experience of playing a horror game is very different from the experience of watching like a horror movie or a horror television show, where empathy is still a huge part of it, like identifying with the characters. It makes you on the edge of your seat. It makes you anxious and nervous for what's going to happen. But when you're playing a video game, suddenly you are that character. Now you're potentially in danger. And like if you look at survival horror, for instance, where you have a lot of disempowerment, a lot of your agency is taken away. You can't necessarily fight back. I think that the drive for that kind of media is also very interesting. And it sort of lines up with something that I've been noticing in audience discussions of newer horror films, where there seems to be this increasing interest in bad endings, where, like, you know, we had a long string of the good guy overcoming evil, defeating the threat that was out there, but also like the final girl trope. And there seems to be at least some movement for the audience away from wanting that victorious ending where the evil is overcome and wanting evil in some way to succeed, which is sort of weird when you think about it, but it matches up with this kind of disempowerment thing that we see with some video games.
I mean, it might just be as simple as, you know, that idea that scholars like Robin Wood and Noel Carroll came up with, you know, this idea that horror is supposed to be a story where we see the status quo restored by the end of it. You know, the people defeat the monster that comes in and upsets the way things are and restores everything. And now maybe, you know, given the state of the world and, you know, what's going on out there, people want that status quo shook up in different ways. So maybe that's got something to do with it. I don't know, but it could be.
Yeah, and then the pessimist in me worries that people are just starting to accept a defeatist attitude towards these things because of everything that's happening out there. They're like, yeah, you know, evil's gonna win. What can you do? You gotta survive. That's the existential horror of living in the 21st century, it seems.
I mean, I think the other interesting thing, and I think even when you were talking about the book on exorcism, is that in some other cultures, there still remains more of a belief in the devil and more in the belief of the rituals that would, you know, that would conquer the devil, if you like. And I'm thinking like Indonesian horror and Malaysian horror, in which you have that, which I find so interesting because you have that kind of belief in hell, and you have, you know, the kind of things that we used to see, and perhaps it gets very postmodern in kind of like Western cinema. But you know, something like Satan Slave, which is a kind of remake of an earlier film. I mean, there's some great films coming from Indonesia, which are also very different, because the rituals that they need to exorcise the devil are quite different. So the prayer rituals are very different. And so for me, I kind of think there's some really interesting stuff around, you know, the battle between good and evil in much purer terms, I think, than what we're seeing in terms of where perhaps we no longer have those same beliefs to hold on to, you know, and whether, I don't know, because I've seen some stuff with my students around freedom indexes in particular countries, and it seemed interesting that in countries that had lower freedom indexes, the horror was more horrific. That there was something in the horror that was, I don't know, the kind of commentary in horror was much more direct, that the more censorship there is, somehow the more perhaps you need horror to articulate those things. You know, it becomes a form that you can use metaphorically. You know, so like all the Italian giallo, situating them within, you know, World War II, and that kind of commentary on the complicity of Italy with you know, the Holocaust. And so I think it's just interesting, those kind of, and I was thinking that because I think I hadn't really seen a good sort of exorcism film for a long time. But I thought I have, but not in the West, not in the kind of films that I've been seeing. So I think that's, you know, good and evil as kind of, I don't know. I mean, we could talk about the fall of the House of Usher, couldn't we? And it seems to me that's kind of a film where, a TV series where the boundaries between good and evil are very nebulous. I mean, like there's really, even the good character dies at the end of it. But I think that was, I mean, in terms of something that's commenting on society with the kind of thing against, you know, big pharma, if you like, and corruption. I thought that was a really interesting TV series. And I kind of wonder whether, like for me, all the Poe references are great because I started in the Gothic and I used to teach the Gothic. But I'm wondering if you weren't someone, if you were a younger audience that hadn't read all the Poe and didn't get all those references, what it is you would get out of it? Is it the kind of commentary on those kind of pressing social issues? So I just thought that was interesting. I kind of have this thing about how different audiences respond to different films.
Yeah. I think we definitely see that in horror. Different audiences can watch the same horror movie, and some might see the social commentary or bring their own social commentary as a way to maybe justify their watching it, whereas others are just, you know, watching it for the scare, the gore, and things like that. Princess?
To piggyback on Colette's comment about she in the West, she's not seeing movies about horror, about exorcisms and stuff like that. And I agree. In recent years, that people are cooling down on the religious, especially Christian symbolism in the West. Like in the 90s and in the early 2000s, you had Bless the Child, End of Days. You go on this, and then in the 80s and 70s, you had the Exorcist. So so people were to save yourself, you had to go in the church, and now you know, now you don't need to go into a church to save yourself.
Or the church is, you know, the religion is the evil. It is the scary thing.
Yes.
Chris?
Yes. And
go ahead. Sorry.
And I think that's a social commentary on itself, is that sometimes religion can be evil and exploitive, or people are moving away from religion and realize they do not need religion to tell them it's good or bad, or I'm good or evil, or this is evil, this is good.
Right.
Well, and I think part of that too, just to kind of piggyback off what Princess was saying, I think part of that too is we're seeing more films made for a faith-based market. You know, I think about like one of the biggest movies of this year was the one about the guy and the child trafficking, like Under the Banner of Heaven or whatever. And so I think we're seeing more, and again, you know, it all kind of comes from like a political economic thing, because I think we're seeing more films that are aimed at that faith-based market. Suddenly we don't have to have all these big Hollywood horror films, but we're still seeing a lot of films like that. Like I think this year we just got The Pope's Exorcist, which, you know, for anybody who hasn't seen it, is fantastic. But that kind of goes along with what Princess was saying, is that idea that the church is kind of a villain in that, because they, you know, they've been like hiding things, and it's, you know, it's more like instead of like The Exorcist, it's more like a mashup of The Exorcist, James Bond, and the Da Vinci Code in a bunch of ways.
Sure.
But then we also, you know, from that political economic standpoint, we have studios becoming much less risk averse than they ever were in the past, and are focusing heavily on IPs, which is why we see, you know, more Halloween movies, more Friday the 13th. We just saw a new Exorcist movie. Now that Exorcist movie, I don't know how well it did box office wise, but with critics weren't like super enthused by it. but we're seeing a lot of this stuff coming out because that's what the studios are focused on, because they want to wring as much money out of those IPs as they can. I think for younger audiences, horror has migrated online in a lot of ways, which is why we see things like the creepypasta website, or we see things, you know, like these weird internet folklore, like the giant demon with the stuff.
That one's terrifying.
You know, I think we're seeing a lot more people who aren't interested in traditional media. Their horror is, you know, the games like we saw in Everybody's Going to the World Fair, you know, where people are kind of role playing these weird horror games, or they're going to creepypasta and making these things, or they're going and sharing stories about the ghosts that they've seen and all that sort of stuff. So
yeah, I mean, I personally am really fascinated by the explosion of paranormal investigation online, and the extent to which you have to have this co-construction of belief in the paranormal, but then there's also that attempt to scientifically legitimate it too. And I just find all of that very fascinating. Christine?
Yeah, talking about kind of the creepypasta stuff in the online spaces for horror, there was also that brief like AI horror thing. I don't know if anyone caught that, about the AI generated cryptid lobe. Where, you know, there's this whole story of like, oh, this horrifying figure started appearing in my AI generated images, and she was doing all of these terrible things that I wasn't telling AI to have her do, which I think is also an interesting movement given the technology that we have, and maybe some fears around technology, which is a pretty common theme in horror as well, but bringing it to people's direct experience rather than being a piece of media that you're watching or even playing.
I mean, I think that type of thing too, that kind of user-generated horror that we might consider, just demonstrates that horror is one of the oldest genres in humanity. This is one of the key forms of oral storytelling that we had. We still have that, like around campfire stories and everything, but just the willingness for humans to get together and to build these stories together as a way to, you know, potentially explain things. Like a lot of conspiracy theories are essentially horrors in their own right, or the way to bond, to, you know, teach empathy, to teach moral lessons and all that. Horrors have been a primal force, I think, within human civilization, or even just humanity, maybe, since we could start uttering symbols that we recognized.
I mean, that's kind of because, isn't it? Because that we're all going to die, and so that's kind of like the kind of reality of our lives. And so horror is one way, or the argument is one way of overcoming that fear, or coming to terms with that fear, or confronting that fear. So it is something which is very, at the kind of very basis of whom we are. So I think that's right. I mean, it's something that legends and folk tales and campfire tales have always been a way of kind of negotiating our fears and externalizing them, and by externalizing them, overcoming them. So I think, that's the the annihilation of the self is it's the fear. It's like the abject, the kind of stave kind of abject, that which is part of us that we put aside, but then we take it out and we confront it. So I think that's kind of why horror as something is universal, and the language is universal. So I think, yes, there were specific things. So like in the films that I've been watching, like the Indonesian Malaysian films, there's specific things. But there's things like, when you're trapped in a building and all the lights go out and you only have a match, that's frightening wherever you are, So I think it does, perhaps more so than comedy, which is kind of like the other genre, have something that's universal about horror across nations and across periods.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we really want to take this to in an evolutionary psychology perspective, we evolved being able to kill to eat. And I would imagine when you have like a mammoth or a tiger or something coming at you that you need to kill it, that's going to generate quite a bit of fear. And so when we start developing those metacognitive abilities to start thinking about our thinking and thinking about our feeling, I think it would make sense that you would want to externalize those feelings into a creature that exists outside of you that you could potentially kill, because you know that killing something that's causing you to feel afraid makes you stop feeling afraid.
One thing that I think is really interesting about horror these days, I know since we're talking about the current state of horror and all that, is especially when you go into the creepypasta or similar types of thing, is how we're seeing more emphasis on the unruly. In the past, and as somebody who grew up with horror, there were like rules to horror. I mean, you saw them kind of codified in like the Scream film and all that sort of stuff, and there were these like rules, and if you followed the rules, suddenly you could defeat the horror. But now I think we're seeing more of a shift toward things that are unruly. Like I think about like the movie It Follows, which didn't set up any kind of like backstory or rules for whatever this thing was. It's just you have sex and suddenly this thing is following you until it kills you. And I think we see a lot more of that sort of thing in these like internet folklore stories. I think about like there was one that I remember a couple of years back went really viral, where it was like there's a little girl in bed and she's like, "Oh Daddy, there's some monster under my bed," and the dad goes under the bed and the little girl's under there. She's like, "Daddy, there's a monster in my bed." And it's like the thing is on the bed, and I'm just, why would it tell you that there's somebody under the bed? Why wouldn't it just kill you? This is ridiculous. There's no rules. And I think that sort of reflects this idea that all of our institutions are sort of starting to break down, and nobody knows what's going to happen next. And so I think horror, like contemporary horror, is sort of reflecting that idea of like systems breaking down, and there's just no rules, and what do we do now? How do we deal with this?
Which is also interesting, because just quick thinking about like the YouTube paranormal stuff I investigate, it also sometimes is just people who are doing like urban exploration, or they're going around and they are finding places that are decaying and they are exploring those. And that again, there's that horror of seeing something recognizable, seeing something that should be normal, like a normal building, and seeing it in such a state of a decay after maybe just several years, is kind of speaking to that horror of the world around me is crumbling and I don't know what to do about it.
But
I think
sorry.
No,
But I
go
was
on,
saying,
Chris.
I was saying that isn't what the Blair Witch Project was about, going and investigate and explore. And yes, they were looking for the Blair Witch, but they didn't. There was no rules, kind of. So what I'm saying is that it's this no rules kind of horror is nothing new. It's kind of going back to nostalgia, like to things like the Blair Witch Project. Yeah.
Which might have informed a lot of people to do this type of urban exploration too, which Christine.
Yeah, I also, and this is like kind of a tangent, but I was curious to see other people's thoughts on it. Aside from the sort of no rules trend that is happening, especially with like kind of fan created content that we're seeing, I think there's also a trend of like sort of horror as a background for other things, and people experiencing some horror media, not for the horror, but for something else that it's about. So I think about like Doki Doki Literature Club, which is a dating sim that is horror, but for the most part, players still experience it as the dating sim. Or like, even if you look at the series Interview with the Vampire, it's horror and it's gory and there's a lot of terrible stuff happening in it, but people are really focused on the romance element, which I think is interesting, because you have these horror media that are supposed to be scary and supposed to be engaging that way, but a lot of people don't necessarily experience it for the horror and keep watching it for something else.
But there's in recent years, or even before recent years, there was always a mixture of horror and comedy, or horror and romance, or horror and fantasy. And sometimes you couldn't distinguish between what is horror and what is fantasy. Like I give an example: Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Angel. Are they horror or are they fantasy? Vampire Diaries, the originals.
Yeah.
So horror has always intermingled or overlapped with other genres.
Mhm.
I mean, we can go back even further and look at the old Robert E. Howard Conan stories, which were ostensibly fantasy stories, but had Lovecraftian elements sort of creeping in at almost every story.
Well, and when you go back to like Gothic novels, where a lot of these horror elements start, a lot of them are also just romance stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's that idea of, horror creeping in at all times. Life is unpredictable and all that sort of stuff.
I know. So I'm kind of wondering that some of the stuff we're seeing come out of America is kind of like informed by the Trump years. And so that, but I do feel that the world is so horrific at the moment that perhaps that's why we're having so much horror. I mean, it's just so difficult, I think, I kind of, because I teach media, I'm sort of watching what's going on in America and what's happening in, Palestine and Gaza, and it's just so horrific. Just, and you feel there's nothing you can do, that you can't change this. I'm looking at stuff with Trump, and I'm thinking, how do we get there? I mean, how do we get there? And how do we get to a place where all these lives are being lost and nothing's really done about it? So I think we are in a particular time where real life horror has outstripped horror, and therefore horror is trying to do something else because, what we're seeing is just so horrific.
I mean, speaking as an American right now, and knowing that there are people around me who still support Trump or support that type of extremism, I would love to know that this was all just an invasion of the body snatcher situation, and that all of what they're doing is explained by demonic possession or alien or something, because then it means I could solve it, but I don't know how to solve this, and that's the true horror for me.
But I think that's that to me is kind of the basis of horror in a lot of ways, because we're in all this stuff right now, and everything seems terrible, but you can keep going back. Like, I'm sure people in the 1910s were like, oh my God, this war is going to end the world, and I can't believe that there are people getting gassed over there. We can keep going back and seeing that the world has always been terrible and awful and beyond all of our capacities to like do anything about it, because there are so many big geopolitical things going on in the world. And horror, one of the reasons why it resonates so much, and this is not an original idea in any way, but one of the reasons that it resonates so much is just that it helps us process this stuff. And I think somebody, was it Christine that said it, or Colette? I don't remember who said it, Princess, but it's a way for us to deal with these issues and see things going back to normal, and that's what it was for a very long time. And I think we're seeing a shift where people are just like, things aren't going to go back to normal, and they maybe shouldn't go back to normal. And so who knows what's going to happen next. And so I think that's informing a lot of the horror that's coming out these days, where it's just kind of ambiguous and weird, and you can't do anything to stop it.
Yeah. Well, we're getting towards the top of the hour, so I kind of want to wrap up with, maybe a little bit of an interesting discussion on what would be something from within the past couple years that is horror that you would recommend others check out, and maybe why? What do you think is the interesting thing for people to go see? Maybe some of these things that we've been talking about occurring.
Yeah, so there's a film that I saw on the way back from Malaysia, called Motel Melati, and it's also been made into a TV series. But I actually thought it's a great piece of horror, quite kind of, people getting together in a house and they come face to face with the things that they've done in the past. So it's quite traditional, but really, really interesting. And I would also say there's a film called Tiger's Tears that Tiger Stripes that's out at the moment, which is an Indonesian film by I think, female director. And that, so I would kind of say, look outside of the West, look at Indonesia, look at Malaysia, look at some of the less well-known places. So we know Korea and we know Japan, but look at like Taiwan.
Yeah,
That's what I'd say. Look away and see some of the stuff that's been done elsewhere.
yeah. I'm gonna throw Laos out there too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was going to be mine. Like, there are so many things, because I think horror there's a lot of really good stuff out there. I mean, like, I loved Hereditary. I thought The Last Matinee was a really interesting throwback in a lot of ways and should be used. But Maddie Doe, if you've not seen her films, they're really interesting. Especially her most recent one, her Chantali is a few years old at this point, because I think that was 2010, if I remember correctly. And her most recent one was, I think, 2018, and it finally just got like a disc, like a Blu-ray release not too long ago because of rights issues and stuff. But even her most recent one, The Long Walk, is really fascinating because it's more like, there's like sci-fi time travel elements, but it's also like really just sort of weird existential horror, as well as environmental horror, because it's sort of set slightly in the future. And I don't know, there's just a lot of really good stuff. And I think one place to look for it is, venture onto the internet, because there's a lot of really fascinating things going on here. I just discovered recently a YouTube channel called Don't Walk Home Alone at Night, which was founded by an animation director named Andy Coyle, who worked on the Netflix series Hilda, if anybody's seen that. And he's directing these weird horror shorts now. He's got two of them. There's one called like The Pine Creepers and one called The Worm. And they're just these animated shorts that are pretty effective overall. So, if you're looking for horror, maybe venture not just beyond the West, but beyond the confines of traditional media.
Christina, princess?
Well, I'm going to go with nostalgia, with the what's out there. The series Chucky is
I need to check
really
that out.
good. I love it. I really do. It's set pre the last movie, before the last movie. So if y'all has seen the recent last movie, I think it was like in 2020 or 2009, something around there.
That Cult of
Because
Chucky.
Chucky movies move every 5-10 years. There's a Chucky movie. But anyways, it's really good. And it goes more into the psychology of Chucky. And so you understand why you don't root for him. You kind of understand him more, and you do understand Andy and his stepsister. If you saw the second Child's Play movie, Andy had a foster sister. So that was good. I did like The Last Matinee. I recommend that. I recommend this movie, Mama. It's supposed to be horror, but it is horror. You do get scared, but it's kind of like you see some family, what some of the things about family, what is family, what makes family, but I recommend that. I Um, recommend Get Out, of course. I will always recommend that. I think it's a good social commentary on racism and don't trust some people. Yeah. And I will recommend the chilling Adventures of Sabrina on Netflix. It's horror, but it goes into it's kind of you're not sure if it's horror or if it's fantasy or if it's horror romance. So it goes into different genres. And also in addition to looking outside of the West, Netflix has some great um horror movies, not only from the West, but
Yeah.
low budget indie movies from other places. You just go. Netflix is good for that. I mean, yeah, yeah.
I should shout out Under the Shadow on Netflix, which is what is it like? Was it Iranian?
Iranian one with oh god.
Jinn.
Yeah,
that one's creepy.
That's a great atmospheric horror movie. Christine?
I mean, I mentioned Interview with the Vampire earlier as a good kind of horror series that people don't necessarily focus too much on the horror. It's really well done though. Also some social commentary there, a lot of updates to the original stories that I think work really well, particularly in the context of like United States and racism and dynamics related to that. And I think these are just fresh in my mind. So sorry if they're too updated, but Talk to Me was really good, even though a lot of people kind of read the social commentary and that one is a little bit heavy-handed. And I also like Dark Harvest is a new one that's also very weird, but did some interesting things. And I don't want to give spoilers or anything, but I thought that they did some cool stuff that subverted some expectations.
Now, I'll give mine. I know when the pandemic started, I made the mistake of rewatching Contagions, the Soderbergh movie, and 28 Days Later. And I not then was a good time to do it, but I think even though they were made, before the COVID-19 pandemic, I do think that they are interesting to rewatch, given that mindset, especially the beginning of 28 Days Later when there's no one out on the streets of London and it's very eerie and creepy. It was that interesting sense. But then I haven't really seen a lot of horror movies that I think are that scary lately, except for the South Korean zombie stuff. I do find those terrifying. I do make the mistake sometimes. There are two YouTube channels I like to watch. One is called Nukes 5, Top 5 or whatever. And he does a lot of the compilation videos, but I like how he does compilation videos of what are supposedly terrifying things, but more so when he shows it as the real human stuff that people are doing to one another. That is legit terrifying. And then along with that, there's another YouTube channel called Chilling Scares, where sometimes they'll show like security footage, again, of real people doing real things that are scary. But a lot of times he gets these stories of what people experienced and he reads them. And it's the atmosphere of his tone of voice, the music that he's playing, some of the still image illustrations and what he's showing. It's really good for atmosphere. And I found myself when I had COVID, I was listening to these and I kind of found it reassuring to listen to these scary things when I was going through COVID. I probably need to do an autoethnography to figure out why that was. But all right, we're over the past of the hour. So I want to thank everyone for coming in today. This was a very fascinating discussion and it's got me pumped to watch some more scary movies the next 5 days until Halloween. And
Halloween.
Halloween is big in Ireland too. I mean, they got a day off. They actually get a holiday. No school.
Wow. All right, I want that imported over here because that would be fantastic.
Well, it's originated from Ireland, so the
True.
Irish should go into
the
houses are decorated. So yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
jealous. All right. All right. Well, I hope everyone has a good spooky season, at least fictionally, and I hope factually the horrors start to subside, and wherever your loved ones are, I hope everyone is safe. So thank you, everyone.
Thank
Okay,
you.
bye.
Bye.
Bye.